picking up on this back and forth between you guys. Pro-competitive versus anti-competitive divides the world into two sets of criteria, which I would say are not enough. So a lot of what we're talking about is businesses, which happen to be monopolies or have some dominant position, doing many things. And a lot of these things are not distinctly pro-competitive or anti-competitive. They're simply a business trying to do what a business does, which is develop itself and maximize profit over the long term, which might sometimes inhibit competition, might sometimes promote or incentivize competition. But I think this third wheel of none of the above is important. And it's especially important with regard to something which has been kind of floating around since we began, the idea of excessive pricing or state intervention in excessive pricing. And I want to focus on that, both because we're in Israel, and this is a huge issue in Israel right now, and because it arises in both other jurisdictions, but also in other contexts, when we spoke about FRAND licensing, etc. So the basic distinction which is important is that when we talk about unilateral conduct is between conduct which is exclusive, so I'm trying to inhibit other competitors from entering or from staying in the market, and conduct which is exploitative. And this is standard, we all know it, but I want to delve a little bit into what do we mean when we say exploitation. And this goes very much together with what do we mean when we say a conduct is unfair. And we had this session in the beginning where the word fairness was floated about and a lot of discussion about should we or should we not stress this. So being in Israel, in which the law is based, indeed some of it copied from the relevant then EC, now EU treaty, the word fairness appears quite distinctly. If you want to follow the law, then you need to decide what this fairness means. And I think fairness or unfair behavior and exploitative behavior are maybe not synonymous, but very, very similar. And in order to decide what fairness means, at least for application purpose, for implementation purpose, we need to have some underlying decision about what people deserve. I would say exploitation is taking from someone something which he deserves to have. And if we're talking about excessive pricing, at least in the standard way, then we're talking about taking from the consumer. In antitrust, we talk about wealth transfer, which I think is a mischaracterization here, because wealth transfer means I'm taking something from the consumer which he has, and I'm taking it to myself. Whereas where I sell something to the consumer at a price which might be deemed excessive, I'm actually dividing the surplus between, let's say, me, the producer, and the consumer, at the same time as I'm allocating the good. So there's, in my mind, a huge difference between going to someone and taking something which he has, and going to someone and saying, listen, if you want this thing of mine, here are the terms of trade, and I want a bigger share of the surplus. Now, you might argue that I have an obligation as a producer or as a monopolist to sell to the consumer at some price which you might deem fair, but then I want to talk about where that obligation stems from, and especially I want to say it's very different from the standard view of unfair exploitation, in which I take something which he had before I came into it. In other words, excessive pricing is about fairness rather than efficiency, and excessive pricing, or the idea that there is a general inhibition on monopolies to demand excessive price, stems from the idea that a monopoly has a duty to provide to the consumer something at a price which the consumer finds preferable. I think these are not obvious statements. I think that I could argue, and sometimes I did argue, the exact opposite, that I do not have a duty to provide, at least not a general duty to provide in all types of goods. And I want to stress, go a little bit into detail about what has been going on in Israeli law in this realm of excessive pricing, because for me it's a great prism through which to look at unilateral conduct more generally. So, we all know what excessive pricing is, whether we have it in our jurisdiction or not. In Israel, it is a relatively new point which is brought up in the courts, and this is because David, as the previous antitrust commissioner, basically put out an opinion saying this is a problem, and it's a problem because monopolies do this thing which we're trying to stop them from. We are trying to stop monopolies from firms from becoming monopolies. We're trying to stop market power because we're trying to limit the price with which consumers are charged. First of all, I take issue with that characterization because it assumes that the end result is consumer price, whereas I would say the end result of antitrust law is the competitive process, and the end price has a lot more to do with industrial policy or with ideas of division of surplus in society, and these can go together, but they don't necessarily go together. So I think it's a coherent argument to make that antitrust is important because we want a vibrant marketplace, because we value the participation in the marketplace, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that every consumer has a right to a specific price or what you would deem a competitive price on every product. So there's a lot going on in this, but basically I would say excessive price, when Bill was talking before about the protection of competition versus protection of consumer aspect of competition agencies, so excessive price has a lot more to do with consumer protection than protection of competition. Also, when we think that we should limit excessive price, we are basically assuming the stability of monopoly, and we're assuming the existence of a monopoly on something in which the state needs to interfere. And I want to say there might be different types of products with different justifications. I do not think personally that it's a good idea for the state to protect every consumer of every product, especially not in this way. And basic question is, if we did not think that monopolies were so stable, then we would think that a price which is high is attractive to entrants, and we would say, no problem, maybe there's an interim problem, but protecting the current consumer comes at the expense of the future consumer or the future competitive process. Now, if we think that most monopolies are stable over time, and that we think entry barriers are high and there will be no entry, then maybe we can say, well, I cannot protect the process of competition, I can only protect the end result. In other words, that is an argument for protecting some types of goods in some types of markets. It's not an argument for protecting all goods in all markets, which is what antitrust does. Antitrust, at least currently, at least in their jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, does not differentiate between types of products. Now, Michal was saying before about around 30 cases of excessive pricing being brought, 20 some of them being cheese or some derivative of milk products, so not exactly. I have a list of 25 cases which Menachem gave to me, which basically are cases, most of which are around milk products, because there was or is a milk monopoly in Israel which is declared, some of which are around other products, but almost always the selection of cases being brought depends on how easy it is to litigate them. So either a declared monopoly, which I can focus on, or something in which there was a change, and I'll just mention two of kind of bring out what stands out. And one is a suit against the price of sliced yellow cheese of a certain brand, and the other is a suit against the price of business class tickets direct from Tel Aviv to Mumbai. Now, it's not, these are legitimate products. I mean, it might be funny to hear like that, but why these? The suits being brought are because they are easy to prove to a court, because A, I have an easy comparison, sliced cheese versus block cheese of the same type, so I can argue only about the difference in cost, and then say that the difference in price is too much larger than that difference in cost, or because I have a distinction across time. So El Al had a monopoly de facto over direct flights from Tel Aviv to Mumbai for a variety of reasons. That monopoly was then changed because of a regulatory change. Suddenly we have another direct flight from Tel Aviv to Mumbai, and of course El Al reacted as most do when competition enters and lowered price. And the distinction was greatest in business class tickets. So I'm not arguing that the pricing was competitive. What I'm saying is that if you focus on excessive price, you are creating a selection bias in the types of cases brought. And that is specifically because of the institutional makeup of who controls this thing which we call excessive price. So if it were the antitrust or the competition authority, which comes and says, we will be the price regulator for stable monopolistic products in which we do not anticipate entry, a different set of arguments could be put forth against or for this, but at least I would see a coherent framework for why this is part of the competition authority's purview. What happens, in fact, is the competition authority is not involved in these cases, almost. These are private plaintiffs, and what they need to do is just bring a suit, bring economic testimony, choose something which is really easy to compare, and going back to the idea of fairness, bring a comparison which a trial judge will look at and say, yeah, I can see this very clearly. In other words, not the most important products, not the problematic cases of poor consumers or limited consumers who need to have this product, but what is easy to prove, and that's fine for a private plaintiff, but it's not the greatest idea for public policy. As opposed to this, when I look at how prices are controlled when the state decides that they need to be controlled, there's a specific state agency in charge of this in Israel. There's a specific law, which is oversight of products and services. In that case, in order to limit price, a number of things have to happen. First of all, there needs to be a decision that this product is a basic product. So milk, bread, flour, something which for some reason we think we really need everyone to have access to this. Universal telephony is another example, okay? Second of all, assuming we decided the product is important enough to control, then there's an examination of the specific markets, investigation of the key players, learning of how they operate. Afterwards, an investigation of their specific cost, which is very, very detailed, and then a calculation according to a coherent and stable methodology across products of how we calculate return on investment and allow people to profit on their capital expenditures, and periodic updating of all of this in order to make sure that we are still having the price in line. This is very, very different from what happens with private plaintiffs bringing private suits in court, which takes a snapshot of reality one time, never goes back to it again, and does it only in those cases in which a plaintiff found it profitable to sue, either because he had an easy comparison or because he thinks the company will settle with him in order to make the suit go away, and we have quite a bit of green mail going on here. I think that's bad public policy, and I think it takes antitrust in exactly the wrong direction where it should be. Both because it takes our focus away from the competitive process and puts it on the end result, and because we do not limit the implementation of this idea to those products or those consumers which truly deserve or we think need our protection. And that is something which is, I think, a bit problematic because it takes the focus of the courts towards other directions, and it uses the terminology of antitrust in a way which it was not planned for to begin with. So when we talk about antitrust, we talk about efficiency and we talk about fairness. But we have this idea of what it means, which is not necessarily well translated into the excessive pricing realm. When we talk about antitrust, we also focus on dynamics, which is exactly the opposite of what happens here. Because in private suits over excessive price, we have a snapshot of reality. We have nothing into the future. We have nothing about capital expenditures. The methodology that was published by the competition authority stresses marginal cost, which is something which is blind to previous investment, would be too strong a way of putting it, because the guidelines do allow some for return on previous investment, but that is not the focus of the courts, and it is not the core competency of the courts. Now, I'll finish in 1 minute. Take into account that this focuses on what antitrust is used to define as monopoly. So in Israel, above 50% of a relevant market. But what is a relevant market? So we have, for example, a declared monopoly in Israel of cola drinks, which is defined as black, sweet, carbonated drinks sold in specific sizes. Now, for antitrust, that's fine, because I want to make sure there is competition in every distinct market, and we need those narrow definitions. But for price controls, I would argue it's a very, very bad idea. And if we want price controls, then A, do it through the standard way. B, if you want more control, if the argument is any product which is monopolized, the consumers deserve to get at a price which is somewhere in the vicinity of competitive price, the way to do it is not through private suits, and it's not through the Israeli Competition Authority. The way to do it is by going back to the oversight law, which controls prices for very basic products, and adding on, like Spencer said before, comma and exploitation. I would say these products in control are controlled, comma, and those products which are monopolized. Now, I don't think this will happen. I don't think the law will change. But I think that if you believe prices should be controlled...
It already
It already says it.
It already
It already says it.
And monopoly is...
Yeah, and monopoly is dependent on how you define it, and especially how you implement it. If you want control of prices over all kinds of products in the economy, I think there are a lot of arguments against that, but if you want to do it, put it in the same institution that does it with other products, go by the same methodologies that work with other products, and avoid the problem of selection bias which happens in private litigation. And I think this is true for other unilateral conduct with some changes.
I have a very short question about the cheese one.